Good afternoon. I'm Jordan Roth, and this is episode 41 of DALLÄSTHETIC podcast. I'm happy to be sitting here with Vicki Meek today. Welcome, Vicki.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm very thrilled to be doing this.
Well, I had a wonderful trip to Houston recently to see two exhibitions of yours. A retrospective at the Museum of...
Houston Museum of African American Culture.
Okay.
Yeah.
Houston Museum of African American Culture. And then the other show...
was at Trans Art Foundation.
Yes. Yeah. And it was quite an immersive weekend, but I couldn't get enough. And it was sad to have to get back on the interstate and head back north, because I felt like maybe there must be there's something else. I know there's something else, but there will be, I guess, something else.
Yes.
Coming up in January. That's terrific.
Yeah, I'll open the third exhibition, which was always planned as a part of this retrospective at the Community Artist Collective, because what I was trying to do was to hit all of the entities that were really my art life in Texas that showed my work. So I'll do a community engagement project with Project Row Houses the same weekend that I open the exhibition at the Community Artist Collective.
Wow.
Yeah, because first was the Community Artist Collective that showed the work, and then Rick Lowe showed the work. And then I was in the first cohort of artists that was doing Project Row Houses.
And then some of that work made it into the museum there.
Well, the work that he curated into Fresh Voices, what was it, Fresh Visions, New Voices, or something like that. That work was what got curated into the Museum of Fine Arts Houston.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you've been here in Dallas for quite some time.
Yeah, I've been here since 1980.
A lot of your artistic career has flourished outside of Dallas.
Yes.
And Houston being one of those places. In Dallas, though, you've been known for quite some time as being an arts advocate and activator and everything else.
But an artist.
Everything but an artist. And so we always knew you were an artist, but it was so nice to be able to actually see the work. When did you know you were an artist?
Well, according to my parents, it was when I was 8 years old, when I announced that I was going to be a sculptor. And that was because my brother was doing, I had an older brother who was doing art. And so I started doing it too. And for some reason or other, I was always interested in three-dimensional work. I didn't do a lot of drawing as a child. I worked with clay. And we had a place in Philadelphia called the Fleischer Memorial Art School, which is still there. It was an offshoot of the Philadelphia Museum of Art. And any public school kid could go there free on Saturdays. And it was taught by the faculty of the various art schools around Philadelphia. So, I mean, we were getting instruction from these amazing instructors, and they took us seriously as kids. It was none of that make it, take it nonsense.
Yeah, amazing.
So I was working in clay as an 8-year-old. At every Saturday, I'd go to my art classes, and then after that, I'd go to my dance classes. And I came home one day, and after one of my classes, and said, and I think it was because Mr. G, who was my teacher, said, "You're such a great sculptor." I came home and told my mom and dad I was going to be a sculptor.
Wow.
Yeah. And they immediately went out and got James Porter's book that had Elizabeth Catlett in it. And so it had Elizabeth Catlett and Selma Burke, various black women sculptors, so that I could see that that was a possibility.
Wow, that's terrific.
Yeah. So from day one, I've had Elizabeth Catlett as my mentor.
And did you go off to college as an artist?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. That was the other unusual thing about my parents, is that they did not discourage any of their children from doing art or an artistic endeavor, because all of their kids were in the arts. And even though neither one of them were artists, but they were collectors, and they believed that if you were creative, you needed to, use that creativity. So I first went to Rhode Island School of Design. I matriculated there as a freshman. That was in 1967, and it was a very lonely experience. I was the only black female on the entire campus.
Oh, gosh.
And obviously no black faculty members at all. And it was not a situation that I found exactly exciting. After being there for a few months, I was just like, ooh, this is a little bit strange. Because I was used to a lot of different kinds of people. And it was a very wealthy school. And although we weren't by any means poor, we were solidly middle class. These were wealthy, wealthy people. And I had no experience with those kind of people. And it's quite frankly, have totally different values than what my parents brought me up with.
Right.
And so it was a very eye-opening experience. But it gave me some real insights into the art world, because these were the people whose parents, had owned galleries, or who were patrons of major galleries and were on the boards of museums and all that kind of stuff. So it really did give me a very early eye-opener about what the art world was all about.
Well, that's helpful, for sure.
Yeah. And then I transferred after I was there a year and a half, I transferred to Tyler School of Fine Arts. And that's where I actually got my BFA.
And that's in Philadelphia?
Outside of Philadelphia,
Okay.
yeah. It was well, now it's in Philadelphia.
Yeah.
But at the time, it was in a place called Elkins Park,
Okay.
which was outside of Philadelphia. They had their own campus.
Now, how did you get into working with artists?
That really came probably, I would say, I started getting interested in curating when I taught at Kentucky State University. They had just opened a brand new art building with a new gallery. And so because the faculty was small, I was the only one that had any interest in doing that. And so I started putting together exhibitions for the gallery and bringing in artists from outside of Kentucky. And that really, I think, was what sparked my interest in working with other artists to get work out there. When I came to Dallas in 1980, in theory, I was not going to do arts administration anymore, because I had been an arts administrator in Connecticut when I'd moved from Kentucky to Connecticut. And I really just wanted to do my work. So I said, yeah. And that worked for a while, but then when I got pregnant and we wanted to have a house, the bank told us that somebody had to get a job. And I was that somebody. So there you go.
And how long were you at the South Dallas Cultural Center?
Almost 20 years.
Wow.
Yeah, very long.
It's such an amazing place.
That it is.
Great things happening there all the time. So let's talk about your work again. And I want to kind of introduce it. Well, I'm not introducing it. There was a video that was at your exhibition, I guess put together by you and Dr. Lauren Cross.
Well, actually,
Christian Vasquez.
No, actually, Christian and I put that together. Because Lauren felt strongly that even though the exhibition was going to be primarily the discrete works that I have done over the years, she felt very strongly that people had to know that that was not really my main mediums. What I was really known for was my installation work, and so that had to have a presence, even if I wasn't going to do an installation. So we decided that we would do a video and have them see the installations and have me talk about the installations, and that's what Christian and I put together.
Well, I'd like us to watch a little bit of that,
Sure.
and we'll talk about it right afterwards.
Sure. For over 30 years, I have worked in the medium that is called installation, and I guess the reason that I did that type of work was because although I was trained as a sculptor, meaning that's what I got both of my degrees in, was sculpture, I figured out pretty early on that I could not be satisfied just making an object and sitting it on a pedestal or standing it on a base or whatever. I could not be satisfied with that as the only way in which I could express myself, because I could never say everything I wanted to say in a singular object. And I think that's what sort of drove me to explore installation. I realized that was what I wanted to do, that I absolutely wanted to simply use space as my canvas, and then a number of different media could be employed within that space to tell whatever story I wanted to tell. And I am essentially a storyteller, meaning I'm looking at things that are of interest to me, and saying something about them, having a narrative about that particular issue. When people ask me how I work, I often think about the The work is pretty much done in a very improvisational way, meaning I don't necessarily end up with what I started out doing. Jazz is a very important part of my process. I'm always playing jazz in the background as I'm working, and it's a music that I've been very attached to all my life. I've come from a family that has got a number of jazz musicians in it, but I also have always appreciated that music because there's something about it that speaks to me in a way that no other music form does. And I think a lot of it is because it's so improvisational. You never know exactly who you're going to hear or what you're going to hear when you're hearing a musician play. You never hear a musician play a tune the same way twice. And I like to think when I'm doing my work that I think of the work in that way. I want to look at it, and then I want to look at it again and see something else. And I want to keep working that way so that finally when I'm done, I have something that has gone through a real metamorphosis as far as the imagery is concerned, and the way in which I say what I'm trying to say is not, I don't settle for whatever has been the initial thought. I will always push it a little bit further and improvise a little bit more with how I say it. And the materials I use, I'm also very improvisational about that, because I might start off thinking that I'm going to use one type of material, but because of the way in which the work starts moving, I'll end up with a totally different material. And I love the fact that that's pretty much the way jazz functions. And so jazz is a pretty critical part of what I do as an artist. The other thing that's important for me is that, once I had my children, my actual focus began to change as far as the work was concerned. Whereas in the early years, my work was very in your face. The political content was very straightforward. I began to explore another way to have these conversations that would be a lot more, I guess, all-encompassing of not just the political, but also the cultural that I was interested in, meaning I wanted to begin to infuse African aesthetics and African spirituality into the work. And so that's when I began to look at symbolism and ways in which I could use these symbols to convey a message without it being a literal message, but instead have people really contemplate what they were looking at. And it was in those early days that my ex-husband suggested to me that I start using a symbols key, that I would, when I would have an installation, I would have that symbols key on the wall so that people could interpret what they were seeing, because I knew that a lot of the symbols that I was going to be using were not necessarily familiar to most people. And it was important for me that people actually engage in the work and not walk away totally dumbfounded. So I thought that was a great idea, and I started doing that as a routine. I started also looking at African cosmology and trying to relate that to some of the things that I was trying to say. So you began to see some of the iconography that was apparent in African cosmology showing up in the work. And then the other thing that I began to do with these installations was to incorporate more than just physical things, but sound became important. So there were often soundscapes in these installations, and smell. So there might be incense or some other kind of fragrance put in the space, so that people would have a sensory experience that was beyond just what they saw. So that I was really looking at a way in which a person would enter into one of my installations and really have to be forced to be involved in it on more than just I guess more than just a visual level. So that's the practice that I began to pursue, and I primarily did work that was about the social political conditions of African Americans or African people in the world. But as I said before, the work became more than just an exploration of a single political situation. And almost always it looked at the way in which that particular situation had a spiritual impact on my people. And so primarily that is what my installations have been about for the last 30 years.
Of course, I'm familiar with installation work, but I've never heard the expression. I'm using space as my canvas, and it makes more sense than anything.
Yeah, well, and you could probably imagine as a sculptor that, I'm already working in 3D, so it's not much of a stretch to talk about going beyond that to seeing the space as
And working within it.
As opposed to putting things in it, making the space determine what I talk about, how I do it, how I say it.
What was the piece, the big round?
Oh, yeah, that was a great one. It was called quote advice unquote. I did that at Women in Their Work Gallery.
Oh, wow.
And it was a piece that looked at the way in which women get advice from other women, either bad or good advice, and how that drives, who they are as a person. And I interviewed, I forget how many women, I think it was 60 some odd women, but they ranged in age from teenagers to women who were like in their 80s.
Wow.
And some of it was very, very humorous, and then some of it was real serious in terms of the kinds of things that people were told that were damaging to them. So those red pieces of paper that you saw people reading, those were the pieces of advice. And they were rolled up there on red rice paper. Of course, red is a protection color, but it's also a color about luck in other cultures. So they're rolled up and put into a promised milk bottle. And then they're put in a circle that's divided into 16 with blue lines, 16 parts, which is based on 16 calorie divination system of Ifa. And then all around that writing is the myth of how Oshun got power for women. And so, I'm looking at this whole idea of women being very powerful in Ifa. And if we are true to ourselves as women, then we too can have that power. But if we begin to use the way in which we communicate and deal with each other in a negative way or in a way that's debilitating, then we diminish that power.
Right.
So that was kind of what, and then you didn't see the front of the installation. It was a room. We created a room within a room. In the front of it, the walls of that entryway had shelves that had sacrifices to Oshun. So there was a rooster, there was some white cloth, and there was some shells and things of that nature. So those were on shelves in the beginning when you come in.
What can you tell me, I guess, of a high level, overview of African cosmology and how it relates to your work?
Well, I mean, it's first of all, it's very complicated. It's not just one cosmology.
Yeah.
What I'm looking at specifically is the cosmology surrounding Ifa,
Okay.
Which is a particular religion in Nigeria, and not just Nigeria, but really Western Africa. And I have been using it more as a way of kind of thinking about humanity and the way in which African people move in that sphere. I use the iconography that is an extension of that, which came to the Americas by way of Cuba and other places in the Caribbean. So some of those icons that you see that's what they are. They're the lifting of the plate, which is supposed to be a sort of pictorial way of looking at a person's full life as they go from birth to they ascend to the ancestors when they die. So that imagery you've seen in several of my installations. I use the farewell arrows as another way of talking about the ancestors. So most of the work that I'm doing around the cosmology has to do with having a sort of symbol for the ancestors and the way we connect to the ancestors.
It's very interesting. It seems like it maybe is an overlay to some of the parables in Scripture.
I'm not a Christian, so I couldn't tell you anything about
I'm
that.
not either.
So two non-Christians are going to talk about Christianity.
Yeah, I don't know.
I don't know.
Okay. We've got some other images I want to ask you about too, if we can get those on. You deal a lot with iconography and women throughout history. I love this so much.
I do too. If I
Yeah.
have to say, I love this too. This is Ida B. Wells, and I do numerous things to her throughout my work. I mean, I've done that particular silk screen was done at Siri Art Workshop, print workshop in Austin, and it was looking at that symbol that's next to her. Her particular symbol means, "I am not afraid of you." And, the woman was fearless.
Yeah.
Truly fearless. And so I have done pieces with her and that icon. I've done pieces with her and sayings from her writings, as well as some other things that she's done around women's rights and what have you. And so between her, Harriet Tubman, there's several women that I just sort of repeatedly bring up. Ida B. Wells is one of them. Harriet Tubman is another one. Ella Baker is another one, and Fannie Lou Hamer. So those are women who I feel like embody all of the things that I find important about being a Black woman in America. Staying true to the community, uplifting the community wherever you can, and never saying die. You keep it rolling.
Yeah, and it's a timeless ways of being.
This is another one of the ones I did to Ida B. Wells.
Those I didn't include installation shots because I want people to go see the show. But and these are kind of weird crops, but
Yeah. Well, this is the piece you have.
Yeah, so this is the partner
these
piece.
What I called those were spiritual portraits of those people. And so, no, I don't know what their heads are in Ifa, but I have determined based on their characteristics, the people, the orishas that I feel are associated with them.
Yeah.
So that's what you have in there, that sculpture that represents one of those orishas, and then who I consider that person to be with the sacrifices to that orisha in that little shadow box. So I think you have Nat Turner.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then the other one that was in the show was Ella Baker.
Okay. And what did Ella Baker do?
Ella Baker was amazing. She was a staff member, actually, with STLC, with Martin Luther King and Roy Abernathy and the whole group of men, and was really the architect behind a lot of the things that are often attributed to the men as far as planning for various and sundry actions. And then she became the advisor to all of the young people in SNCC, and really encouraging them to go off and do their thing, because they were not having any kind of success getting through to their leadership in SCLC. So she became like the mentor to Stokely Carmichael and that whole group of SNCC workers. She was a strategist, amazing woman in terms of understanding the way in which you move change forward. And she became probably one of the most important people in the architecture for the March on Washington, and along with Bayard Rustin and some others, but she was also in there, determining what needed to be done. But more importantly, she was the architect for a lot of the social actions that were taken by young people during that time period.
Wow, I had no idea.
Well, people don't talk about her
Yeah.
a lot. I mean, those of us in the movement knew all about her, but people don't talk about her a lot. And they recently, not that recent, but I guess about within the last 15 years, there was a documentary done on her, and it was really good. And there's several books that have been written on her, so she's not unknown
Yeah.
to the civil rights historical record, but she certainly should be talked about a whole lot more than she is.
It would seem so. When people encounter your exhibitions, what do you hope that, they're seeing your work for the first time? What do you hope they take away with them?
Well, obviously the work is historically based, so I'm looking at various aspects of African American history or African history, but mostly African American. So I definitely want them to walk away with the spark that says, maybe I should look into this a little further. Because what I don't do is I don't give you everything.
Right.
It's sort of like I give you some information, and hopefully it's interesting enough that you're going to want to go and pursue it a little further. And that's what I'm hoping people walk away with is the desire to learn more and hopefully to know something that you didn't know when you walked in.
It was an absolute learning experience. One thing that I really enjoyed was, well, let's talk about the Hoochie Mamas real quick.
Okay, the Hoochie Mamas.
Tell me about the Hoochie Mamas.
Well, the Hoochie Mamas, actually, the first set were the black and white ones.
Right.
You know,
Yeah.
and that series was called If Only She Knew.
Right.
And the idea was that, you know, these two young women who I was looking specifically at the way in which hip hop has given us the kind of lyrics that are very demeaning to women, and particularly black women, since that's who primarily that was a art form that came out of the black community and the Latino community. And I was looking at these young women who were becoming kind of like strippers practically in these videos, and they were willingly doing it, and without having any seeming knowledge of the way in which black women had been sexualized from day one, from the minute we were brought to these shores, and the fight that black women had to gain respectable standing in their own community, not to mention other communities, because they were seen as simply breeders.
Right.
You know, they weren't really seen as people. And so I wanted to situate these women on top of all these women over throughout history who have fought to have us have dignity. And then they're shrouded. Mm-hmm. So, you know, obviously the women don't know who these people are. And then they're anchored by two Mende heads. The Mende Society in Sierra Leone are a society that worships women, basically. I mean, basically the word woman means you're beautiful.
Oh, wow.
You know, so there is no differentiation. You got to be too thin, you got to be this thin, or you got to be this color or whatever. Women are beautiful. So they're anchored by those women, and then the cowrie shells are always in my work for a symbol for the ancestors, but also a symbol of good fortune and, you know, wealth and what have you. And that's all laced in gold with words running through it, if only she knew.
Yeah.
And then across the top, behind them rather, in gold, is another one of the stories about Oshun. And because, you know, as being one of the most powerful women in the pantheon of Orishas, there's a story about her power, and it's all behind these young women because, of course, they don't know. And then the white rooster, which also appears constantly in my work, is a symbol of the ancestors. The white rooster's on their head. It's not coming through their head. It's sitting on top of their head, because the thing is, it's information that they can get. It's not like it's hidden. You know, they can get it. The second set came after I was having this conversation with my son, who is the hip hop king. And he said, well, you know, Mom, someone in your generation raised those Hoochie Mamas. So, you know, somebody, y'all got to take some sort of responsibility for this. And I thought about that, and I said, you know, he's absolutely right. So the second series was entitled, Where Did We Go Wrong?
Okay.
And that was looking at, you know, the same kind of, you know, sort of devolution of being, as far as, you know, who you are as a woman, and turning into this sort of sex symbol. And you start off with the first woman in the red outfit, and she's got clothing that is beginning to be revealing. And I use the lyrics from songs, which I also do a lot. I use a lot of lyrics in songs. The lyrics from these hip hop songs that were demeaning as you go through the succession of images. The first one is actually Grace Jones.
Pull up to the bumper.
Yeah, remember that? Well, you might not remember it.
I do remember.
Okay, there you go. And so that was the beginning of it. And then they get progressively worse in terms of the way in which they devalue women. So by the time you get to the last one with the blonde hair sitting on top of the sculpture, you know, she's a lost cause. And it's really, once again, we didn't do anything to help her not be a lost cause.
Yeah.
You know, we did not, us women of the movement, we did not see our role, I think, seriously enough to say we have a responsibility to, even if it's not our own child, you know, to make sure that these young women understand whose shoulders they stand on.
Right.
You know, because it's no light matter. So that's what the image, and then you'll see like the blue line, because you know I use the blue as a protection color. The first young lady, her blue line is around her, but it's broken.
Yeah.
So it's beginning to fray. by the time you get to the last image, the African mask, that's a female mask, is sucking the blue line back up into her because she just doesn't know what to do.
Oh,
It's just
wow.
like, I don't even know how to protect this young lady.
Yeah.
And then you noticed on the bottom, the bling begins to get more and more blingy. With the first one, it's anchored by these two African bones that are on either end. By the time you get to the last young lady, it's just all bling, all along the bottom. It's just nothing but bling.
Yeah.
And then, of course, the roosters are in there as well.
They translate interestingly now, when you have like this, the empowerment of being, I don't think they would say hoochie mama, but like say like Lizzo currently is a
I had to look her up because I didn't know who she
Yeah, she's
was. I saw what she, what her thing was.
so she's enormously popular, and she's like owning her sexuality and all of that. So it's upon first approaching that series, I was like, oh, this is interesting. And then I realized that they were from decades ago, but still so current.
Well, the conversation is different now.
Yeah, the conversation is totally different.
And it's interesting to me because a younger person was talking to me about this whole feminist idea and how did I view this.
Yeah.
And I said, because they were talking about people like Beyonce, and I said, let me just tell you what my feeling is about it. I said, if you're a feminist, a true feminist, you don't marry a misogynist. So
Yeah.
I think her thing is about a commercial thing.
Yeah.
She's making money.
Right.
But quite frankly, you don't marry a misogynist if you are a feminist. So you can take that any way you want to. So my kid said, "That's a Twitterism."
It's a good one, actually.
I'll use it. Don't worry, it'll show up somewhere. So that's why I think even though the conversation is taken a little bit of a turn because of the way in which young women are sort of claiming their power through sexuality, I always maintain that it really, to me, you have to go deeper than just, I have the right as a woman to do anything I want.
Right.
To see, well, who's really controlling this image? Who's really putting this out there and putting the rubber stamp on it? It's kind of like the blackface thing with black people. It's like,
It's
oh,
all
you can,
marketing and-
exactly. And
yeah.
you can think you're controlling it, but if you didn't make that up,
Right.
it ain't about you.
Yeah. I see what you're saying. An empowering piece that I approached at the show was, I don't know if it was empowering necessarily, but it meant something to me, was the Mississippi Goddamn.
Oh, yeah.
Because I encountered Nina Simone like early on, in my teens, and just I read the story of her singing that at Carnegie Hall and how over the top that was at the time. But the lyrics are just just there. So you've got this piece where on one side you've got like the fight song for Alabama and
No, it's actually the Mississippi.
Or Mississippi.
It's the Mississippi.
I mean Mississippi.
It's the Mississippi anthem.
The anthem, yeah.
Yeah.
So you've got all this, this white bread stuff on one side, and then you just have the lyrics for Mississippi Goddamn, and then some really, really haunting imagery on that side. And so when I'm viewing that piece,
And then don't forget.
oh yeah, when I'm viewing that piece, I can hear the words in my head and the tone, and then I'm looking at was it Emmett Till?
Emmett Till and Medgar Evers are,
Yeah.
and then the Cheney, Schwerner, and oh God, I'm forgetting his last name. Cheney, Schwerner, and Goodman, the three civil rights
Yeah.
workers that were murdered. So it's all of their images along with Klan imagery and all the things that were the black reality
Yeah.
of Mississippi.
And it's just amazing, the same place, two very real realities, but encountering that piece was really something for me.
That had that impact on you.
Yeah, the whole show. So I want to tell everybody that the show is on view through, the retrospective is on view through February 16th. And the show at Transart is again.
That's up through April of 16.
Into April. Very, very much worth the trip to Houston, no matter where you are. And it's been an absolute pleasure to sit with you today.
Well, thank you for having me. And thank you for being interested in the work in that way.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Well, I think that's it for today.